for joining us here on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and each week we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories of the City of Mississauga. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. Joining us this week for Ask a Historian is a return guest. This is John Dunlop, Manager of Heritage Planning and Indigenous Relations with the City of Mississauga. And we're here to explore a topic that has been kind of front and center in our news in the last couple of months. So, John, thank you once again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Pleasure to be here.
The topic, I mean, it's going to open maybe a can of worms in terms of discussion. I can't imagine we'll be brief on it, but connects to the Antrex Archaeological Site. And for those that maybe, first of all, that haven't heard of it and don't know about it, or those that have heard a little bit of rumbling in the newspaper, particularly about a month and a half ago, there was a motion before council. I'm just wondering, can you give us a brief introduction, I guess, of what is the Antrex Archaeological Site, and maybe kind of a history of what prompted an archaeological excavation in the first place?
Absolutely. Thank you. So the Antrex Archaeological Site is what's known as a village site. And what that means is it is the location of a former village. And this village, based on the artifacts, based on what we call settlement pattern, and we'll get into that in a little bit, and basically what all the archaeological finds that go into the site, it was determined that it was a site that dated to sometime during the 13th century. It was occupied, estimated between anywhere from 400 to 800 people, and it would have been occupied for a span of about 20 to 40 years. And it really was, when you think about it, it was one of the first locations of a city in Mississauga before there was a city, before our present day city. And that's what is, I think, the most interesting part of it, is that it's, as I've always said when talking about archaeology, the reason you find archaeology is because wherever you find it, it's a great place to live. It's a great place to live today. It was a great place to live 800 years ago. It was a great place to live 5,000 years ago. That's why we find the archaeology there. So this particular site, it was found as part of a regulated archaeological process. And what I mean by that is, so first of all, I'll go back to when it was documented. And the site was documented between 1991 and 1994. And in 1990, there were some major changes that were made to Ontario's Planning Act, where it included, for the first time, considerations of archaeology. Before development occurred, before the land was reshaped and modern construction occurred and so forth, it was a new requirement that developers had to have the land assessed for archaeological sites. And then if archaeological sites were found, they had to be mitigated. And mitigated basically means either completely recorded through excavation or protected long-term. So the Antrex site was found in 1991. Back then, the property was all farmland. And so the site would have been found. The way archaeologists do most of the work here in Ontario is, if it's an active farm field, they'll have the field plowed, and then they wait a couple of days or sometimes weeks to get a couple of good rainfalls. This is actually a really good time of year to get out and start plowing while we're recording here in mid to late April, because you get rain pretty much every day. And so the reason you wait for that rain is because if there's an archaeological site in the soil there, the plow will kick artifacts up onto the surface, and then the rain will wash off the dust and the loose dirt and so forth, and you'll be able to see the artifacts sitting on the surface of a plowed field. So archaeologists go out and literally walk the fields back and forth. We do it at standard intervals, and there's a row of maybe 5 or 6 people, and they're walking up and down and back and forth and looking for these artifacts. And you have a site because you'll start to see 1, 2, and then a whole cluster of artifacts, or as we call it, a scatter. And so the site was first documented as an artifact scatter, and it was determined that It was a significant archaeological site. Villages being, when I say common, I don't mean that there's a lot of them found, but they were very commonly found across southern Ontario. But they are very, very important archaeological sites. And then over the following 2 years, there were several archaeological consultant firms that did some excavations, as well as some work by field school from University of Toronto, Mississauga, that carried out excavations on the site as well. And then all that wrapped up, and what they found was a site that had 6 to 8 longhouses. It was kind of hard to tell based on some of the settlement pattern, and what was called a palisade, which is a wall or a fence made of branches and logs and so forth put into the ground. And it extended over I believe 4,000 square meters. It was a very large site. There were over 40,000 artifacts found. There were multiple features and settlement patterns, and features are literal stains in the ground which show where there was something. Sometimes it's a pit, sometimes it was a hearth. The walls of the palisade can be found because a longhouse is built using branches and boughs and so forth of trees that are driven into the ground right beside each other, and so you get these oblong shapes that are identified by all these dots that are left in the ground from where those branches decomposed. And what you're left with is very much a plan of a village that existed some time ago, in this case 800 years ago.
And I think maybe first from a geographic perspective to place our conversation on the modern cityscape, just to the east of Hurontario Street and Bristol Road, in that area, the adjacent to, and one of the reasons this came up so recently, you've already mentioned that the archaeological dig was 91 to 94, so we're not dealing with something that happened recently, but in kind of the city speak, so to speak, we're a few decades ago now, but it came to the fore recently because of the city acquisition of the Grand Highlands Golf Club property, which is immediately adjacent to where the archaeology was found, right? We have this it's kind of come back to the forefront, I guess, through modern land acquisition.
Yes, absolutely. And the Grand Highland Golf Course had shuttered its doors some time ago and was up for sale, and the city purchased it for use as parkland, which is what's going to happen. And immediately when reviewing the acquisition, I said, I noticed that it was. At first I was concerned that it was on the Antrex site, but then determined very quickly, no, it wasn't, but it was immediately adjacent. And when we talked to the Indigenous communities, the descendants of the people that lived at the Antrex site, one of the things that comes up time and again in discussions is saying, where are we in modern day Mississauga? The GTHA it probably has some of the highest levels of erasure of Indigenous peoples in the country. A lot of Indigenous history has been completely eradicated to make way for the modern city in which we live. And arguably, the Antrex site is a very well-known site. It's been, Heritage Mississauga has published about it many, many times. It's got its own chapter in the first 10,000 years. There have been multiple PhD theses written on it and the artifacts and so forth through the University of Toronto and Mississauga here. But to a broader context, it's very unknown. There's a crescent up near where the site was that's named Antrex Crescent, and there's another street called Middleport. I believe it's a crescent as well. Yeah. And Middleport is an old archaeology term for some of the artifacts that were found, and we don't really use it anymore. But that's really all there was as a way of a marker. And this is the city before the city. This is hundreds of people that lived here. And so it was an opportunity to tie in the redevelopment of the golf course into a park and address the city's efforts on reconciliation, of saying, one of the ways in which the city is addressing reconciliation is by reversing the erasure of Indigenous history, of Indigenous people. And here we're going to have a public space. We're going to have a place that everyone is going to be able to come and visit, and it's immediately adjacent to a village. There isn't a better opportunity to get into these discussions with Indigenous communities, with the descendants of the people that live there, and say, how can we express your history? How can we make sure that people today in Mississauga don't forget who the original inhabitants of this land are? Who have a rich and deep history that goes back since time immemorial on these lands. As long as there were people living in Ontario, these have been the people that have lived here. And it's an incredible opportunity to address some of these issues and, try to reverse the erasure and the forgetfulness which has occurred regarding Indigenous peoples and their history, in urban settings in particular.
One of the terms I use quite a bit when I speak out in the community, and is say, keep in mind, wherever you walk, wherever you drive in Mississauga, somebody has been there before. And in this case, we're talking, generations upon generations before. And you made the reference to Indigenous communities, which a plural. We know that Mississauga is part of the traditional and territorial lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit River, or Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. But the Antrex site is multi-layered, and your conversations are broadened to more than just the Mississaugas, right? In terms of this recognition of our history, it's a multi-layered story and history of this site.
Absolutely. I mean, it speaks to the history that occurred since the village, from an archaeological context. And I do want to stress that what we're talking about today is mostly talking about the site from that archaeological perspective. There is a complete other perspective, which is the descendant community, which is the Indigenous peoples that have their own way of talking about their history. And it's important to remember that we need to work that story into the archaeology, which is what we plan on doing in the park. But the way that archaeology works is we tend to create generalizations based on patterns that we see. It's archaeology is a bit of that puzzle game of, you have bits and pieces. You have the material culture of past peoples, and you're trying to figure out who they are and how they lived based on that material culture. And that material culture is never complete. Again, there were not buildings that were found at the Antrex village. There were remnants of the villages, or of the buildings rather. So you're dealing with an image of a foundation, not even a foundation. And you're dealing with multiple broken artifacts and pieces that you're putting together. And so using that, and Ontario archaeology has been a flourishing academic discipline for going on 150 years here. And so the site was identified as being ancestral Wendat. And the Wendat were one of the groups that lived in North Shore, Ontario during this period, about 800 years ago. And they were also known as the Huron by the French when they came into contact with them. But when Europeans did arrive, they were living up in an area that we now call Huronia. So, which is up, the Midland, Barrie, Orillia area. So they had moved from the sort of North Shore of Ontario and moved up further north. There's another group of people that were known as the Adoandaron, or also known as the neutral people, but the name for themselves was the Adoandaron. And they also lived not in sort of the same area. It's sort of widely held that the Credit River was a bit of a boundary between the two groups, but it's not a hard and fast boundary. So from an archaeological perspective, we make an assumption that the village was ancestral Wendat, but the story of the Wendat is complex in and of itself, as it is with all people. And shortly after contact, the Wendat Confederacy was at war with another confederacy of people, the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee lived a little further south into New York State and Niagara region and so forth. And they were warring over basically present day Mississauga, Toronto, Durham region, everything along the North Shore of Lake Ontario. It was a contest between the local superpowers, if you will, because they were both the Wendat Confederacy and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were two very powerful confederacies of people. And the Haudenosaunee prevailed in this particular conflict, and the Wendat Confederacy, some of them were taken to be adopted by the Haudenosaunee people. Some of them were killed, and some of them migrated, and they eventually moved into the islands up in Georgian Bay, and then down to the Detroit River and outside of Detroit. And then another group moved into present-day Quebec. And that group that moved down to Detroit, some of them stayed there, but an even larger group ended up continually moving west through the United States as the United States was being created. And they now reside in present-day Oklahoma and Kansas and are known as the Wyandot Nation. But they trace their ancestry back here to Ontario. So you have a large group of nations that can all trace their ancestry back to this one particular site. And that's the people that lived in longhouses and so forth. There's the also Anishinaabe people who would have also lived on this site as well, who are the ancestors of the present day Mississaugas and the Odawa and the Potawatomi and the Three Fires Confederacy. So there's a large group of individuals, basically any Indigenous person that lives in at least Southern Ontario and much further afield can in some way trace their cultural or even their own biological ancestry, but cultural ancestry back to this site.
It's incredible when you think of it in those terms, that how broad a reach this must, a site like this must have in terms of making connections to, living cultures, living communities of connecting back, and how large a task it must be even for yourself to start contemplating the stories that could be told here in terms of the modern park context. Don't want you to roll your eyes a little bit.
No, it's a great challenge to have, because it's about and it's also the opportunity for the people today to talk about how they want their ancestors portrayed, because there's been so much negativity wrapped up in the images of Indigenous people over the years. Yeah. Some, not just positive imagery, but appropriate imagery and an appropriate way of telling their stories, and how they want their stories shared with the settler people that are now living here in Mississauga. Right. There's a huge opportunity here to share this history and help people become aware of it.
Very, very much so, and something we look forward very much to seeing it explored and I guess shared, but develop that story and the storytelling that comes with it is quite an exciting initiative. Back to the site itself, you referred to kind of the artifacts that were found, bits and pieces of things, and the generalities that are concluded from based on what is found by the archaeologists, and these remnants of buildings. Do the artifacts paint a picture of what the lifestyle must have been like for the people who lived here like 800 years ago? Like, do we have an idea of kind of the community itself?
Yeah, it's what's left. I mean, first of all, it's important to remember that after 800 years, Ontario generally has a very acidic soil. So it's not, it doesn't do wonders for the preservation of a lot of the softer artifacts. So anything that was made out of, animal skins and so forth, a lot of botanical remains, unless they're seeds or a hardwood or something, just they don't last. They break down and disappear within the matter of years, let alone decades or centuries. But what the artifacts showed was a subsistence farming community, and one that, you know, despite the fact that when the Europeans arrived, despite the fact that they dressed differently and spoke different languages and so forth, they immediately identified, if you go back and read the writings of the very first Europeans to arrive, they immediately identified villages like these as being villages, as being walled towns, just like you would find in Europe. You know, it was no different. If you go to places in Scandinavia, people were living almost the exact same life way as people that were living here. They had the same tools. You know, as a general look, I've compared our pieces of pottery from sites like Antrex to pottery found in Europe at the same time. It's really not that different. You can find difference when you look for it, but when you think of it, you think of a almost like a medieval farming community. There were groups of people, again, you know, there were these longhouses that were built, and a longhouse would have housed a clan, which would have been made up of several extended families. It was communal living, and there was farming. The site would have been surrounded by acres upon acres of cornfields. They would have grown many other crops as well. You know, you think of the classic Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, but they would have had all sorts of other plants, all sorts of other, you know, raspberries, strawberries. There's a lot of belief amongst archaeologists that the Palisades were actually as much to grow raspberry canes as they were as some sort of defense, which I think just adds to it. Because if you've ever gone raspberry picking, if you have a thicket of raspberries, that's going to keep people out just as effective as a row of sticks. You know, but it was, you know, the village would have been, again, surrounded by farm fields, not, you know, in a, you know, a small area of civilization and encircled by a dark forest or anything like that. You know, they would have had, there would have been families living there. They had, you know, the village had open public area where people gathered and spoke just like they do today. You know, people hunted and fished and did all those things they needed for sustenance. They would have been making art. There would have been ceremonies and, you know, anything and everything happened there. And it wasn't that all life happened within the village either, because the village was just a place where you resided, where maybe you put your head down at night inside the longhouse, you know, and where you took shelter when it was necessary. But, you know, there would have been spaces to play games and all those things that take place in your everyday life. You know, they lived a very similar sort of subsistence lifestyle to that of farmers living all around the world.
Right. And I know the site has evolved greatly. Obviously, we've gone from you know, a pre-settlement landscape to in time, as the site was I guess was no longer being used as a village site, it deteriorated, it disappeared, and a forest grew. And I know the archaeology pictures we have show the archaeologists working in a treed environment. And then of course modern subdivision has been built on the property. So we've seen this layers of change that have taken place over a long period of time. What's kind of the future of the site in terms of those conversations? And you know, the site itself is under subdivision today. Of course, we know that. We have an opportunity to tell a story around it adjacent to the site, but not the site itself. But kind of what's the future of those conversations? Like, you've already said that you're having these conversations, but where does it go from here for you in terms of developing a story for the site? I don't know if the story is the right word, but
yeah, no. So working very closely with the city's parks department, you know, we're going to be talking to the indigenous communities, and you know, as I went through all the descendant groups that that come out of the people that lived at the Antrex site, we'll be talking to the Mississaugas of the Credit. They are the treaty holders for these lands, as well as Six Nations of the Grand River and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council, and the Huron-Wendat Nation, which is located out in Quebec, as sort of being the local and closest descendant communities to that should be consulted as part of this. And it's going to be a discussion of, first of all, hearing from them. How would they like to see this? Like, do they have any preconceived notions? Do they have any ideas? Have they wanted to see something happen, in this regard for years, and there's never been an opportunity to make it happen? Right. That's first and foremost. If there isn't, then it will be a case of working with the Parks Department to determine what can we do, what should we do. Right. There's been a lot of interpretation done over the years, and there's places like Crawford Lake where there's actually reconstructed longhouses and part of a palisade that people can go and freely walk around in and visit and get a sense of what this village would have looked like at the time. There's informational walks. The City of Toronto has one in Scarborough over the Alexandra site, which is a location, and then the Humber Carrying Trail touches on a couple of villages that go up alongside the Humber River. So there's a lot of models that have been out there in the past, but we're looking to see what's relevant today, what's relevant in an era of truth and reconciliation, and what can we do that's maybe different and is engaging and is going to help Mississauga's residents understand the history of their city a little bit better.
A wonderful goal to aim for. You have something in your back pocket, perhaps, that a previous generation of heritage planners did not have, and that is a very strong council motion to support this in this, like you said, this age of reconciliation. Can you speak a little bit about what the decision that City Council made or not too long ago about the Antrex site?
You're right. It's something that it maybe wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. It was everyone in the city, including council. Council has taken reconciliation very seriously. What was important, I think, was the recognition that what we were talking about was the land acknowledgement that gets said at the beginning of council and all the committee meetings. When we start to talk about this site and talking about the descendant communities, and people go, oh, those are the names we say at the beginning of every council meeting. And it's beyond the recognition of the fact that Mississauga carries an Anishinaabe name. It's about saying, we as a city have benefited from the loss of Indigenous people, maybe not intentionally, right, but it is that case nonetheless. And so now is an opportunity to say, how can we start to make this right? How can we be working on this? What does reconciliation look like? And in this instance, to ignore that history that is located immediately beside the park is not reconciliation. So when it came to light where this park was going to be located, there really was no debate in anyone's mind, I don't think, that this was an opportunity to really, really do some placemaking to make it a place that, Indigenous people could come and see themselves reflected, which is not something that usually happens. And it's happening a lot more now than it did, but, it's in a way that they feel at home, because it is their home, and that's really that's what we want, is something where they can feel comfortable and at home.
And what something that the city can look to and say, this is something we are actively working towards and wanting to achieve. I think forgive me, I don't have the recognition statement in front of me, the land statement in front of me, but it says something along the lines, and I know you wrote it, about a place for Indigenous people to feel safe and to thrive within the city, and what better way to start that process in a real sense than to have a place on the ground that tells that story in the words of Indigenous people to what is important to them.
Well, that's it. And taking action on the land acknowledgement that gets stated at the beginning of every meeting is I think what's most important, because otherwise it just becomes words and it becomes a recitation. And that's the major criticism with land acknowledgements. They're meant to be tools of education and inspiration. And so I think it's really important that there's lessons that are being learned and that there's inspiration that is coming from that land acknowledgement, and it proves that it's not being ignored. It's that commitment that because it's a fair criticism to say from Indigenous communities to say, you say these land acknowledgements, how are you backing that up? And we can say we are backing that up because we're recognizing your history. We aren't arguably their village was removed to make way for a new village, to make way for a subdivision. But to then come back to it and say, yes, this was removed, but we're not going to forget about it.
Right. And I guess it points also to the changing thought process that goes in, particularly again maybe during this age of reconciliation that we've moved towards. But what happened with the archaeology 30 years ago happened according to the best practices of that day, and we now have a chance that our understanding, our processes in a sense have evolved. And I remember back to something that Guima Laforme said from Mississauga's Credit First Nation, that we are all treaty peoples and we have obligations reflected in those historic treaties, and in a way, maybe in a small way, this is the city of Mississauga also responding to the fact that we have an obligation here.
Absolutely. And just to go back to what you were saying, it's important to note that what the excavation that happened at the Antrex site was done to the best practices of their day. And it's easy to reflect back and go, I can't believe that an entire village was excavated. This is a really important archaeological site and it should have been protected. Protection, was not there. There aren't a lot of archaeological sites that get that level of protection, and back in the 30 years ago when it was excavated, it was the norm to excavate. As a matter of fact, it was seen as a positive that the site was even being excavated, because before that time period, before the Heritage Act in the mid-70s, sites were getting bulldozed all the time. They weren't ever being documented, and we've lost vast amounts of Indigenous history. So we've maintained that history, and then it has remained in the minds of those of us arguably in the heritage and archaeology community here in Mississauga, but I think a little more broadly than that. And now it's going to live on in a much broader sense, which is the ultimate goal, because there's so much important history to share in this regard. There aren't a lot of village sites in Mississauga. There's only a small handful, and Antrex is the best documented of the ones that we have. Right. So it's almost as if the stars aligned on this to make this happen. I'm excited to see how this is going to evolve in the discussions we're going to have. It will take some time. It's going to be some years, because we need to understand what kind of a budget is going to be required for this, and then figure out how we're going to fund that and so forth. So it's not something that can unfortunately happen overnight, but it will happen. We have a motion from council which tells us it has to happen, which is fantastic.
Yeah. And you're at the beginning stages. Like I recognize, even as we speak of this is in those very early stages of the plan that is yet to unfold. And I'm excited to see it evolve. I'm excited to hear the conversations evolve. I'm thrilled that you are going to be leading a big chunk of this plan, and together with Indigenous communities, seeing what develops in terms of having a story on our landscape that we can share with not only residents of this place, but those whose ancestral ties connect to this place. And I think that's just a fascinating story. So. Thank you very much for sharing this. Like we said, this is this is the prelude to the chapter, right? Like, this is not even we're not even into the meat of of the project yet. And maybe if we can as well, a shameless plug, but check out First 10,000 Years. There is a chapter on here on the Antrex site. Well worth a read for those looking to discover more. We'll share some links as well to some of those papers that are online, as well as the archaeological report, which is online, for those looking to kind of understand more the evolution and the history of the site. But with that, John, thank you so much for spending time with us here and sharing your knowledge and your connection to this story.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew. A pleasure as always.
Wonderful. And thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. As always, send in your questions and we'll explore the history of the city of Mississauga each and every week. Like, subscribe, and follow, and stay up to date on heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. And we will see you next week for another episode of Ask a Historian.